Just before dawn, on the 22nd of June 1941, a Soviet border guard stands in the grey half-light, listening. For days, rumours have spread along the frontier. German trains moving at night, engines idling in the forests, aircraft circling too close to the line. But Moscow keeps repeating the same message: don't provoke the Germans. He feels the rumble before he hears it. The horizon quietly flickers, then explodes. Artillery flashes blossom along the frontier. The ground shakes. Within minutes, the sky fills with the sound of engines, hundreds of bombers and fighters racing east. Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, has begun. In the summer of 1941, Adolf Hitler believed he was unstoppable. France had fallen in 6 weeks. Western Europe was under Nazi control. Britain was battered and fighting on largely alone in Europe. To Hitler, only one enemy really mattered now: the Soviet Union. Barbarossa was not just another campaign. It was an ideological crusade, a war of annihilation. Hitler promised his generals that a swift blitzkrieg would crush the Red Colossus in a few months. Behind the front, Nazi planners drew up General Plan Ost, the blueprint for a new empire in the East. Tens of millions of Slavs and Jews were to be starved, enslaved, or simply erased to make room for German living space. On paper, the numbers looked terrifyingly impressive. 3 army groups, nearly 4 million German and Axis soldiers, thousands of tanks and aircraft. From the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Wehrmacht assembled the largest invasion force in human history. Stalin, meanwhile, had spent the 1930s purging his own officer corps. Thousands of experienced commanders were imprisoned or shot. When British and even some German informants and defectors warned that an invasion was coming, Stalin dismissed it as provocation. On the night of June 21st, Soviet units along the border were under orders not to respond to provocations. A few hours later, the provocation arrived in the form of an all-out war. At 3:15 a.m., 22nd June 1941, German guns opened fire along a front over 2,900 kilometres long. In the north, Army Group North drove towards Leningrad. In the centre, Army Group Centre aimed straight at Moscow. In the south, Army Group South targeted Ukraine's rich farmland and industry. Within hours, the Luftwaffe had smashed many Soviet airfields on the ground. Entire Soviet squadrons were destroyed before they even took off. For many Red Army soldiers, the first sign of the war was not a radio message. It was the sound of bombs landing on their barracks. German armoured spearheads punched through the thin Soviet frontier forces. The Wehrmacht had perfected a way of war the world called blitzkrieg, which was concentrated armour and air power, breaking the front, then racing deep into the rear to encircle entire armies. Soviet units, ordered to stand their ground, suddenly found the road home cut off. In the sector of Army Group Centre, panzer groups raced towards Minsk, leaving pockets of trapped Soviet troops behind. Within days, hundreds of thousands were surrounded. Some tried to break out on foot. Others dug in, fighting until their ammunition ran out. Behind the lines, another, darker war began. Special SS units, the Einsatzgruppen, followed the Wehrmacht. Their orders were explicit: hunt down political commissars, Jews, and anyone labelled an enemy of the Reich. In villages and small towns, columns of civilians were marched out, lined up, and shot. For many people in Eastern Europe, Barbarossa did not arrive as a tank on the road. It arrived as a gun at the edge of a ditch. In the first weeks, the German advance was staggering. By early July, Army Group Centre had encircled hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops near Minsk. The road to Smolensk and beyond it, Moscow, seemed open. Columns of Soviet prisoners, stunned, exhausted, often barefoot, marched west under guard. Many would never see proper camps. They were left in open fields, behind barbed wire, with almost no food or shelter. Nearly 3 million Soviet POWs died of starvation, exposure, and disease in just the first months of the campaign. Inside the German High Command, the mood was buoyant. Diaries spoke of the campaign being practically won. Some generals predicted Soviet collapse before winter. But even in July, the first cracks were showing. Soviet resistance was chaotic, often poorly coordinated, but it was not collapsing as quickly as many Germans had hoped. Improvised counterattacks, desperate stands, and constant reformation of shattered units slowed the German timetable. At Smolensk, Soviet armies managed to form a new front, forcing Army Group Center into another grinding series of battles. Each encirclement cost the Red Army dearly, but it also cost Germany time, fuel, and men. Every kilometer deeper into the Soviet Union stretched German supply lines further. The railways had different gauges. Roads turned to dust under summer traffic. Trucks broke down. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, collapsed in the heat and dust. Meanwhile, in Moscow, Stalin finally accepted that this was not a limited conflict. It was a fight for survival. On the 3rd of July 1941, Soviet citizens gathered around radios as Stalin addressed the nation. For years he had ruled through fear and distance. Now he spoke in a different tone, calling on brothers and sisters to defend not just socialism, but the motherland. Across the country, factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped east, beyond the reach of the Wehrmacht. Entire industrial cities were uprooted and rebuilt in the Urals and Siberia. It was a logistical nightmare, but it kept Soviet industry alive. On the front, the Red Army was learning, brutally and quickly. New defensive lines formed around key cities. Commanders who proved competent in battle began to rise through the ranks. Others simply disappeared. In the south, the Germans won another huge victory at Kiev, encircling and capturing hundreds of thousands more Soviet troops. It looked once again like the Soviet Union might break. But every time the Germans thought they had destroyed the last reserves, new Soviet formations appeared, often under-equipped, sometimes barely trained, but still willing to fight. Behind the front, the War of Annihilation continued. The Commissar Order instructed German units to execute captured Soviet political officers on site. The Einsatzgruppen and their helpers escalated their massacres. Villages suspected of harboring partisans were burned. Entire communities vanished in days. Barbarossa was no longer just a campaign. It was becoming what historians now call a war of extermination on the Eastern Front. By late summer, Hitler and his generals faced a crucial decision. Army Group Center, the same formation that was destroyed in our last documentary on Operation Barbarossa, now stood deep inside the Soviet Union, pointing straight at Moscow. Some generals argued, push on, take Moscow before the weather turns, cut the Soviet rail network, deliver a psychological and political knockout blow. Hitler disagreed. He diverted panzer forces north towards Leningrad and south towards Ukraine, chasing economic prizes, grain, oil, industry, instead of a single decisive thrust at the Soviet capital. The decision cost precious weeks. As German armor moved back and forth along the front, the seasons changed. First came the Rasputitsa, the autumn mud. Roads turned into rivers of brown glue. Tanks and trucks bogged down axle deep. Horses collapsed in the muck. Supplies piled up far behind the front. Then came the cold. Many German units had gone into Barbarossa with the assumption that the campaign would end before winter. They lacked proper winter clothing, antifreeze, and equipment for deep cold. Soviet troops, fighting on home soil, had shorter supply lines and better winter gear. Fresh divisions, some transferred from the Far East, began arriving near Moscow. In October, Hitler launched Operation Typhoon, the final push to seize the Soviet capital. The Germans won more encirclement battles at Vyazma and Bryansk, capturing yet more Soviet troops. It seemed like history was repeating itself. But this time, the Red Army refused to crack. Soviet forces pulled back, fighting yard by yard, digging trenches in frozen ground, using the forests and villages around Moscow to slow the advance. By late November, some German units could see the glow of Moscow on the horizon at night. They would get no closer. Temperatures on the Moscow front plunged far below freezing. Lubricants froze. Weapons jammed. Soldiers wrapped rags around their boots to avoid frostbite. The German offensive ground to a halt. On the 5th of December 1941, the Red Army launched a massive counteroffensive around Moscow. Soviet units attacked along a wide front, pushing exhausted German divisions back from the capital. For the first time in the war, the Wehrmacht was forced into a large-scale retreat. In Berlin, shock set in. The Lightning War in the east had failed to deliver victory. Instead of quick conquest, Germany now faced a long, grinding war of attrition against an enemy that seemed able to absorb staggering losses and still keep fighting. The human cost on both sides was already almost unimaginable. Millions of soldiers killed, wounded, or captured, and a civilian population caught in the gears of a racial war. Operation Barbarossa began as Hitler's greatest gamble, a war to destroy the Soviet Union, seize its land, and reshape Europe under Nazi rule. By the winter of 1941, that gamble had failed. The Soviet state had not collapsed. Moscow still stood. German forces were overextended, exhausted, and trapped in a war they had not planned to fight for years. The Eastern Front would drag on, growing ever more brutal, until it consumed the Third Reich itself. The same army group center that had driven so confidently towards Moscow in 1941 would, 3 years later, be shattered beyond recognition, as we explored in our documentary on Operation Barbarossa, the D-Day of the Eastern Front. Barbarossa did not just change the course of the Second World War, it reshaped the entire century, in blood, ruin, and the memories of those who survived. This is the War Cabinet. Thank you for watching. If you found this documentary helpful, consider subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with someone who's also trying to understand the Eastern Front.